The year is 60 AD. In the Roman province of Britannia, a woman stands before the smoking ruins of what was once the empire's proudest colonial city. Her name is Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. Her hands are stained with the blood of 70,000 Roman citizens. Her daughters stand beside her, their bodies scarred by unspeakable violence inflicted by Roman soldiers. This is not a story of heroic resistance. This is a story of revenge so savage, so absolute, that it would leave a scar on the Roman Empire that would never fully heal. What you're about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about ancient Britain and the true cost of imperial conquest. Before we understand the magnitude of Boudica's vengeance, we must first understand the world she inhabited. Roman Britain in the 1st century AD was not a peaceful province willingly embracing civilization. It was a conquered territory, subdued through military force and maintained through systematic exploitation. The Roman invasion, initiated by Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, had brought the southeastern portion of the island under imperial control. But control, as the Romans would learn, is not the same as submission. The Iceni tribe occupied what is now Norfolk and Suffolk in eastern England. Unlike some British tribes who resisted Roman occupation violently, the Iceni had initially chosen a different path. Under their king, Prasutagus, they had become client rulers of Rome. This arrangement was common throughout the empire. Local rulers maintained their thrones and a degree of autonomy in exchange for tribute, loyalty, and recognition of ultimate Roman authority. It was a pragmatic compromise, one that Prasutagus believed would protect his people and preserve their way of life. Prasutagus was not naive about Roman intentions. He understood that client kingdoms existed at Rome's pleasure and that their independence was always provisional. When he composed his will, he attempted to secure his family's future through a calculated gesture. He bequeathed half his kingdom to Emperor Nero and half to his 2 daughters, with Boudica presumably serving as regent. In the Roman legal framework, this division seemed logical. It acknowledged imperial supremacy while maintaining dynastic continuity. What Prasutagus failed to anticipate was the degree of Roman greed and the complete disregard Roman officials would show for even the pretense of legal propriety. When Prasutagus died, likely in 59 or early 60 AD, the Roman response was swift and brutal. Imperial procurators, the financial officials responsible for extracting wealth from the provinces, saw the king's death not as a transition to be managed, but as an opportunity to be exploited. The local Roman administrator, Catus Decianus, orchestrated what can only be described as a systematic looting of the Iceni kingdom. What happened next would transform a grieving widow into one of history's most fearsome warriors. The Roman agents arrived in Iceni territory with armed soldiers. They declared that Prasutagus's will was invalid under Roman law, which did not recognize female inheritance in client kingdoms. Everything, the land, the wealth, the people, now belonged to Rome by right of conquest. The Iceni nobility, men who had fought alongside Prasutagus and served as the kingdom's warrior elite, were stripped of their positions and enslaved. Their lands were confiscated, their families were scattered. In a single administrative action, the entire social structure of Iceni society was dismantled. But the Romans were not content with mere political subjugation. They sought to demonstrate, in the most visceral way possible, that resistance to Roman power would be met with humiliation so complete that it would destroy any thought of rebellion. They seized Boudica, the queen of a sovereign people, a woman of royal blood, and subjected her to public flogging. In Roman culture, flogging was a punishment reserved for slaves and criminals. To inflict this on a queen was to deliberately strip away every shred of dignity, to reduce a sovereign ruler to the status of property. The message was clear. There was no honor the Romans would respect, no person they considered above degradation. Then they committed an act so monstrous that it would seal their fate. Roman soldiers raped Boudica's 2 daughters. These were not random acts of violence by undisciplined troops. According to Tacitus, one of our primary sources for these events, this was sanctioned brutality carried out in full view of the Iceni people. The rape of royal women was a deliberate strategy of domination, designed to demonstrate that Roman power extended even into the most sacred bonds of family and bloodline. In the culture of ancient Britain, where lineage and honor were paramount, this violation was an assault not just on two young women, but on the entire concept of Iceni sovereignty. The Iceni people watched as their queen was beaten and their princesses violated. They saw their nobility enslaved and their lands stolen, and in that moment, whatever pragmatic acceptance of Roman rule had existed evaporated. The Romans had created something far more dangerous than a conquered people. They had created a people with nothing left to lose. Boudica, her body scarred and her daughters traumatized, would transform personal anguish into a weapon of mass destruction. The Romans had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed that superior force could break the human spirit. They were about to learn that sometimes brutality does not create submission. Sometimes it creates monsters. Boudica began to move through the Iceni settlements, speaking to warriors and farmers, to druids and craftsmen. Her message was simple and devastating. The Romans had demonstrated what submission meant: slavery, rape, humiliation, the destruction of everything that made life worth living. There was no safety in cooperation, no mercy in surrender. The only question was whether the Britons would die on their knees or die fighting. The response was overwhelming. Warriors who had fought against the Romans during the initial invasion and then reluctantly accepted client status now took up their weapons again. Young men who had never seen battle prepared for war. Most significantly, Boudica's call to arms resonated far beyond Iceni territory. The Trinovantes, a powerful tribe whose lands lay to the south of the Iceni, had their own grievances against Rome. Their former capital, Camulodunum, had been transformed into a Roman colonia, a settlement for retired legionaries. These veterans had been granted lands confiscated from the Trinovantes, forcing the original inhabitants into smaller and less fertile territories. The Romans had constructed a massive temple to the deified Emperor Claudius in Camulodunum, and the costs of maintaining this monument to imperial power were extracted from the local British population. The Trinovantes had watched their sacred sites desecrated, their lands stolen, and their people reduced to providing forced labor for their conquerors. When Boudica called for war, they answered. Other tribes joined the confederation. The ancient sources suggest that the rebellion drew support from across southeastern Britain. Each tribe had its own catalogue of Roman abuses: excessive taxation, arbitrary violence, cultural suppression, land confiscation. What Boudica offered was not just revenge for her personal suffering, but a reckoning for every indignity, every injustice, every humiliation inflicted by Roman occupation. The army that gathered under her leadership was massive. Ancient historians claim numbers ranging from 100,000 to 230,000 warriors, though these figures are likely exaggerated. Even conservative modern estimates suggest a force of at least 50,000 fighters, making it one of the largest armies Britain had ever seen. This was not a professional military force in the Roman sense. It was a tribal war band composed of warriors who brought their own weapons and fought in traditional British style. They carried long swords, spears, and shields. Some wore chainmail armor, while others fought in simple tunics. They painted their bodies with woad, a blue dye that created striking and intimidating patterns. British warriors fought from chariots, a tactic that had long been abandoned in other parts of Europe but remained effective in the terrain of Britain. These chariots, driven by skilled charioteers, could move rapidly across the battlefield, allowing warriors to strike quickly and withdraw before the enemy could respond. But what made this army truly formidable was not its weapons or tactics. It was its motivation. These were not men fighting for pay or glory. They were fighting for vengeance, for dignity, for the right to exist as free people on their own land. Boudica had transformed personal trauma into collective fury. Every warrior who joined her cause carried their own memories of Roman brutality, their own reasons for rage. This was an army united by hatred, and that made it extraordinarily dangerous. The Romans, meanwhile, were catastrophically unprepared for what was coming. The governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning in distant Anglesey, an island off the northwest coast of Wales. He was engaged in suppressing the Druids, the priestly class of Celtic religion, who served as a focal point for British resistance. Anglesey was sacred ground, home to Druidic sanctuaries and centers of learning. Suetonius was methodically destroying these sites, slaughtering Druids and burning sacred groves. It was brutal, necessary work from the Roman perspective, eliminating the spiritual leadership of British resistance. But this campaign had drawn the bulk of Roman military strength to the far western edge of the province. The towns and cities of southeastern Britain, the heart of Roman civilian settlement, were left with minimal defensive forces. Camulodunum, the colonial capital, had no defensive walls. The Romans had not bothered to fortify it, believing that their military supremacy made such precautions unnecessary. This hubris was about to be punished in the most horrific way imaginable. The stage was set. Boudica's army, tens of thousands strong, began moving south toward Camulodunum, and the Romans, complacent in their sense of invincibility, had no idea that apocalypse was marching toward them. The first reports that reached Camulodunum were dismissed as exaggeration. British tribes were always restless, always causing minor disturbances. The idea that they could pose a serious threat to a Roman city was absurd to the colonial administration. But as the reports became more frequent and more detailed, describing an enormous war band moving with clear purpose toward the city, anxiety began to spread through the Roman population. Veterans who had fought in the conquest of Britain recognized the danger. They understood that without walls, without adequate military forces, Camulodunum was defenseless. The colonists sent desperate messages to Catus Decianus, the procurator whose actions had sparked the rebellion, begging for military support. His response was contemptuous and inadequate. He sent exactly 200 men, armed but unarmored, to defend a city of thousands. It was an insult, masquerading as assistance, and it demonstrated the Roman administration's fundamental failure to comprehend the magnitude of the threat. Meanwhile, strange omens began to appear in Camulodunum. Ancient sources record that statues toppled without cause, that the image of victory in the temple fell and turned its back to the city, that blood-red tides appeared in the Thames estuary. Whether these events were real or later mythologized is unclear, but they reflect the growing sense of dread that gripped the city. Some colonists attempted to flee, gathering what possessions they could carry and heading for safer Roman-controlled territory. But most stayed, either unwilling to abandon their homes or unable to believe that British tribesmen could actually threaten a Roman settlement. They retreated to the massive Temple of Claudius, the most substantial building in the city. Its thick walls and elevated position made it the only defensible position in Camulodunum. Perhaps 200 people crowded into the temple, men, women, children, soldiers, and civilians together. They barricaded the doors and waited, hoping that relief forces would arrive before Boudica's army. They waited 2 days. Then, on the horizon, they saw what they had been dreading. The British warband emerged from the forest like a force of nature. The noise must have been terrifying, war horns blaring, thousands of warriors chanting and beating weapons against shields, the thunder of chariot wheels across the earth. This was psychological warfare, designed to break the will of the defenders before the first blow was struck. And it worked. Any thoughts of organized resistance evaporated when the defenders saw the sheer size of the British force. Boudica's warriors swept into Camulodunum like a tidal wave. There was no battle. There was only slaughter. The Romans and British collaborators who had not reached the temple were hunted through the streets. Men were cut down where they stood. Women and children were shown no mercy. The Britons were not interested in slaves or ransom. They wanted blood. Every Roman, every Briton who had cooperated with the occupation, every person associated with the colonial apparatus was marked for death. The killing was methodical and complete. Then they set fire to the city. British warriors moved from building to building, igniting everything that would burn. The wooden structures that made up most of Camulodunum blazed quickly, creating an inferno that could be seen for miles. The heat was so intense that it turned the clay beneath the city into fired ceramic. Archaeological excavations in modern Colchester have revealed a layer of bright red, burnt debris, a permanent record of destruction that can still be seen nearly 2,000 years later. This layer, sometimes 6 inches thick, contains the carbonized remains of buildings, possessions, and people. It is a tomb, frozen in time, preserving the moment when Boudicca's vengeance consumed the first Roman city. The refugees in the Temple of Claudius watched the city burn around them. They must have known their fate was sealed. On the second day of the siege, the Britons breached the temple doors. What happened next is almost too horrible to describe. The defenders were killed to the last person. Ancient sources indicate that some were burned alive within the temple itself. Others were dragged out and subjected to ritual execution. The Britons understood the symbolic importance of this temple, dedicated to the deified emperor who had ordered the conquest of Britain. Destroying it was not just an act of war, it was an act of religious desecration, a deliberate rejection of Roman spiritual authority. When Boudicca's warriors finally moved on from Camulodunum, they left behind a landscape of utter annihilation. Not a single building stood intact. Not a single Roman remained alive. The entire population of the city, estimated at several thousand people, had been exterminated. The archaeological record shows no evidence of burial for the dead. Their bodies were left where they fell, to be consumed by fire or left to the elements. This was not conquest. This was erasure. Boudicca was not trying to capture Roman territory. She was trying to remove every trace of Roman presence from British soil. News of Camulodunum's destruction sent shockwaves through Roman Britain. A Roman legion, the 9th Hispana, commanded by Quintus Petilius Cerialis, marched south to confront the rebels. It was a catastrophic mistake. The 9th was one of the premier fighting forces of the Roman army, battle-hardened and disciplined. But Boudicca's army vastly outnumbered them, and the Britons were fighting with the confidence that comes from total victory. The legion was ambushed somewhere along the route to Camulodunum. The infantry was annihilated. Ancient sources claim that 2,000 legionaries were killed. Cerialis escaped with only the cavalry, fleeing back to his fortress. The most powerful military force in southeastern Britain had been destroyed in a single engagement. The destruction of the 9th Legion eliminated the last significant military obstacle between Boudicca and the rest of Roman Britain. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was still in Anglesey, days of marching away. The Roman towns and cities of the southeast lay open and defenseless. Boudicca now turned her attention to Londinium, what would become London, already emerging as the commercial heart of Roman Britain. What happened there would be even worse than Camulodunum, if such a thing can be imagined. The apocalypse was only beginning. Londinium in 60 AD was not yet the massive metropolis it would become. It was a thriving commercial settlement, built where the Thames could be easily crossed, serving as a hub for trade between Britain and the continent. Unlike Camulodunum, Londinium was not a formal colonia. It had no special political status. It was simply a place where merchants, traders, craftsmen, and opportunists gathered to profit from the Roman occupation of Britain. This commercial character meant the population was diverse. Romans, Gauls, Greeks, and Britons living side by side in pursuit of profit. The city had grown rapidly in the 17 years since the Roman conquest. Wooden buildings lined streets laid out in rough approximation of Roman urban planning. Warehouses along the Thames stored goods destined for the legions and for export back to Gaul and Rome. Shops sold everything from pottery to imported wine. Bathhouses catered to Romans who insisted on maintaining civilized standards even on the frontier. It was a place of opportunity where fortunes could be made and lost, and it was about to become a graveyard. When word reached Londinium of Camulodunum's destruction and the annihilation of the 9th Legion, panic gripped the city. Refugees from the destroyed Colonia brought horrifying accounts of the massacre. Merchants began calculating whether they could evacuate their most valuable goods. Families debated whether to flee or trust in Roman military power to protect them. The answer came when Governor Suetonius Paulinus himself arrived in the city, having ridden ahead of his legions with a small cavalry force to assess the situation. What Suetonius saw when he surveyed Londinium convinced him that the city could not be defended. There were no walls, no fortifications of any kind. The population was civilian, with only a handful of soldiers present. Boudicca's army, now swollen with additional warriors emboldened by victory, numbered in the tens of thousands. Any attempt to hold Londinium would result in his small force being overwhelmed and destroyed. The governor made a brutal calculation. He could not save the city, but he could save his army for a future battle where Roman discipline might overcome British numbers. Suetonius gave the order that sealed Londinium's fate. The city would be abandoned. Anyone who could keep pace with the marching legions would be evacuated. Everyone else, the elderly, the infirm, small children, those with too many possessions to carry, would be left behind. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. The scenes that followed must have been agonizing. Families were torn apart as some members were deemed capable of the forced march, and others were not. Merchants were forced to abandon warehouses full of goods. People begged soldiers to take them, to protect them, to not leave them to the Britons. Suetonius was unmoved. Military necessity overrode compassion. He marched his forces northwest, moving toward the junction with the remaining legions. Behind him, Londinium descended into chaos. Some residents fled in random directions, hoping to find safety in the countryside. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, praying that somehow they might be overlooked. Most simply waited, paralyzed by fear, unable to believe that the Roman army had truly abandoned them. And then, on the horizon, they saw the British war band approaching. The destruction of Londinium followed the same pattern as Camulodunum, but on an even larger scale. Boudicca's warriors swept through the city in a frenzy of killing. Men were hunted down and slaughtered in the streets. Women were subjected to horrific violence before being killed. Children were not spared. The elderly were shown no mercy. British collaborators, merchants who had profited from Roman trade, anyone associated with the occupation, all were marked for death. Tacitus, writing decades later based on eyewitness accounts, described scenes of almost indescribable brutality. The Roman historian records that Boudicca's forces had no interest in taking prisoners or selling them into slavery, the normal practice in ancient warfare. There was no profit motive in this campaign. It was purely about revenge, about inflicting the maximum possible suffering on those associated with Roman power. Victims were hanged from improvised gallows. Others were burned alive, tied to posts and set ablaze. Some were crucified. The Roman method of execution now turned against Romans themselves. Still others were impaled on stakes, left to die slowly in agony. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated displays of vengeance, each method of execution chosen to inflict maximum suffering. The Britons specifically targeted sites of Roman religious and civic authority. Temples were desecrated, their statues pulled down and smashed. Public buildings were burned. The bridge across the Thames, a crucial piece of infrastructure, was destroyed. This was not simple military conquest. It was an attempt to erase Roman civilization itself, to purge the land of every trace of imperial presence. The message being sent was clear: Rome was not invincible. Roman gods could not protect their worshippers. Roman law meant nothing in the face of British fury. The archaeological evidence from London tells the same story as Colchester. Beneath modern London lies another layer of destruction dated precisely to 6061 AD. This layer contains the carbonized remains of wooden buildings, burned so intensely that the debris was compressed into a dark, sooty mass. It also contains human remains, people who died in the fires or were killed and left unburied. The pottery fragments, coins, and other artifacts in this layer allow archaeologists to date the destruction with precision. They also reveal the extent of the city. The burnt layer covers approximately 50 acres, suggesting that Londinium was already a substantial settlement before Boudica reduced it to ash. The death toll in Londinium was catastrophic. While precise numbers are impossible to determine, estimates based on the size of the city and demographic patterns suggest several thousand people died in the massacre. Some modern historians argue that Tacitus's figure of 70,000 dead across all three destroyed cities may be exaggerated, but even more conservative estimates place the death toll in Londinium alone at 10,000 to 15,000 people. The city that had been the commercial heart of Roman Britain was now a smoking ruin, its streets choked with corpses, its buildings reduced to charred timbers and ash. But Boudica was not finished. Even as Londinium burned, her forces were already moving toward their next target. The city of Verulamium, modern St. Albans, lay to the northwest. It was a different kind of settlement than the first two. A municipium, a self-governing city whose inhabitants had been granted Roman citizenship. Its population was primarily British, members of the Catuvelauni tribe who had accepted Roman rule and adopted Roman customs. To Boudica and her followers, these were not innocent victims but traitors, Britons who had sold their heritage for Roman privilege. Verulamium met the same fate as Camulodunum and Londinium. The city was stormed, its inhabitants massacred without distinction. Men who had worn Roman togas and adopted Roman names died alongside those who had clung to British traditions. Women and children were killed. The buildings were systematically burned. The Britons showed particular fury toward the symbols of Romanization. The Forum, the Basilica, the bathhouses that marked Verulamium as a Roman-style city. These structures were not just destroyed, but desecrated, their ruins left as monuments to the futility of cooperation with Rome. The pattern of destruction across all three cities reveals something important about the nature of Boudica's campaign. This was not opportunistic looting or indiscriminate violence. It was systematic, targeted revenge. The Britons destroyed symbols of Roman power, temples, administrative buildings, monuments. They killed those associated with Roman authority, soldiers, officials, merchants, and collaborators. They used methods of execution that mirrored or inverted Roman practices. Crucifixion, a distinctly Roman punishment inflicted on Romans themselves. This was revenge that spoke in the language of the oppressor, turning Roman brutality back on Rome. By the time Boudica's forces moved on from Verulamium, the death toll from her campaign had reached staggering proportions. Tacitus claims 70,000 Romans and British allies were killed. Cassius Dio, another ancient historian, gives a figure of 80,000. Modern scholars debate these numbers, with some arguing they are inflated for dramatic effect. But even if the true figure was half of what ancient sources claim, we are still discussing one of the largest massacres in ancient history. 3 major settlements had been completely destroyed. A Roman legion had been annihilated. The entire southeastern portion of the province was in chaos. And through it all, Boudica's army had moved with impunity, unchallenged by Roman military power. The psychological impact of these victories on Boudica's followers must have been enormous. For nearly 2 decades, Rome had seemed invincible. The legions that had conquered Gaul, that had crossed into Britain and defeated every tribe that opposed them, appeared unstoppable. The Roman system of roads, cities, and administration had seemed permanent, and unshakable. Now, in the space of weeks, that illusion had been shattered. Roman cities burned, Roman soldiers fled, Roman civilians died begging for mercy that never came. For the British warriors following Boudicca, this must have felt like divine justice, like the natural order of the world reasserting itself after years of Roman distortion. But military reality was about to reassert itself. While Boudicca's forces had been destroying cities and slaughtering civilians, Governor Suetonius had been gathering his scattered legions. He had marched the 14th Legion and elements of the 20th Legion from Anglesey back across Britain. He had collected auxiliary forces and called in every available soldier from garrisons across the province. The army he assembled was vastly outnumbered by Boudicca's war band, but it possessed something the Britons lacked: professional military discipline, standardized equipment, and tactical doctrine refined through centuries of warfare. The final confrontation was approaching, and it would demonstrate why Rome had conquered the known world. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully. Ancient sources don't record the exact location, though modern historians have proposed several sites in the Midlands, somewhere along Watling Street, the main Roman road running northwest from Londinium. What we know is that Suetonius found a position that negated the British numerical advantage. He placed his legions at the end of a narrow defile, with his flanks protected by forest and a plain stretching before him. This meant the Britons could not use their superior numbers to surround his forces. They would have to attack directly into the Roman line, facing the most disciplined infantry in the ancient world on ground of Rome's choosing. Boudicca's army approached the Roman position with absolute confidence. They had swept aside every Roman force they had encountered. They outnumbered Suetonius by perhaps 5 to 1 or more. Ancient sources claim Boudicca's force numbered over 200,000, though modern estimates suggest 80,000 to 100,000 is more realistic. Even by conservative estimates, the Britons had overwhelming numerical superiority. Their warriors were seasoned by recent victories, emboldened by success, and motivated by fury at Roman occupation. They expected another massacre. Instead, they were about to learn the difference between slaughtering civilians and fighting legionaries. The Britons made a critical tactical error. So confident were they of victory that they brought their families to watch the battle, positioning wagons loaded with women, children, and plunder in a wide arc behind their battle line. This was traditional in Celtic warfare. Families followed war bands, and the sight of loved ones watching was meant to inspire courage in the warriors. But it also meant that retreat, if necessary, would be blocked by their own people. The Romans, meanwhile, stood in disciplined ranks, shields locked, javelins ready. Suetonius, according to Tacitus, gave a speech reminding his men that they faced an undisciplined mob, that British numbers meant nothing against Roman training, and that the future of the province depended on this battle. The British attack began with a massive charge. Thousands of warriors, screaming war cries, rushed toward the Roman lines. Chariots raced ahead, trying to break the Roman formation. It must have been terrifying, a human wave of armed fighters seemingly unstoppable, but the Romans held. As the Britons closed the distance, the legionaries unleashed volleys of javelins. These heavy throwing spears, designed to punch through shields and armor, devastated the front ranks of the British charge. Warriors fell by the hundreds. The survivors pressed on, crashing into the Roman shield wall, but the Roman line did not break. Legionaries fought in tight formation, shields overlapping, stabbing with their short swords, the gladius in quick, disciplined thrusts. The British warriors, fighting individually with longer swords that required room to swing, found themselves crowded together, unable to use their weapons effectively. They pushed against the Roman wall, but it was like pushing against stone. The legionaries rotated fresh men to the front ranks, a drill they had practiced countless times, while the Britons tired themselves in futile attacks. Then Suetonius gave the order for the Roman counterattack. The legions advanced in wedge formation, driving into the mass of British warriors like a blade. The disciplined Roman advance pushed the Britons back, forcing them to give ground. The retreat began to accelerate. Warriors at the back of the British force, seeing the front ranks falling back, began to turn and run. The retreat became a rout, and that's when the Britons discovered the fatal flaw in their deployment. The wagons they had positioned behind their lines now blocked their escape route. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The British warriors, trapped between the advancing Roman legions and their own wagons, were systematically massacred. The Romans showed no mercy. Legionaries killed every person they could reach, warriors, women, children, even the draft animals pulling the wagons. Ancient sources claim 80,000 Britons died in the battle and its aftermath, compared to only 400 Romans. While these figures may be exaggerated, they reflect the reality of what happened. A disciplined professional army had annihilated a numerically superior but tactically outmatched force. Boudica survived the battle. How she escaped the slaughter is unknown. Perhaps she fled early with a small group of warriors, or perhaps the sheer chaos of the collapse allowed her to slip away. But she knew that her war was over. Her army was destroyed. The survivors were scattered across the countryside. The Romans would be hunting for her, and capture would mean a fate worse than death. Roman triumphs traditionally featured captured enemy leaders paraded through Rome in chains before being ritually strangled in the Tullianum, the underground prison beneath the Forum. Boudica would not give them that satisfaction. According to Tacitus, Boudica poisoned herself. The poison may have been hemlock or another plant toxin readily available in ancient Britain. She chose death on her own terms rather than face Roman vengeance. Her daughters' fates are not recorded. They disappear from history after the initial outrage that sparked the rebellion. We can only hope that death came to them more mercifully than it had to so many thousands of others. With Boudica's death, the Great Rebellion collapsed completely. The tribes that had rallied to her cause sued for peace or melted back into the countryside. The Roman response to the defeated Britons was savage. Suetonius treated the entire southeastern portion of the province as hostile territory. Auxiliary cavalry and infantry swept through tribal lands, destroying villages, confiscating livestock, burning crops. The goal was to break the British will to resist so completely that no thought of future rebellion would be possible. Many thousands of Britons starved in the aftermath of the rebellion as Roman forces destroyed food supplies. The procurator Catuus Decianus, whose brutality had sparked the rebellion, had fled to Gaul during the uprising and never returned. His replacement, Classicianus, eventually convinced Emperor Nero that Suetonius's punitive campaign was counterproductive and needed to end. The physical scars of Boudica's rebellion were visible for decades. Londinium was abandoned for several years after its destruction. When the Romans eventually rebuilt it, they constructed it on a grander scale with proper defenses, having learned that walls were necessary even in supposedly pacified provinces. The burnt layer beneath modern London remains a permanent archaeological marker of the rebellion, a time capsule of destruction. Camulodunum was also rebuilt, but it never regained its prominence. Verulamium was reconstructed as well, rising from its ashes to become a prosperous Roman city in later decades. But the psychological scars ran deeper and lasted longer. Roman Britain after Boudica was a changed place. The Romans never again treated Britain as a fully pacified province. Legionary fortresses were maintained at permanent strength. Auxiliary forts dotted the landscape, ensuring military presence throughout the territory. The Romans built walls, not just Hadrian's famous wall in the north, but defensive circuits around major cities. The illusion that British tribes would peacefully accept Roman civilization had been shattered by the blood of 70,000 dead. For the Britons, the rebellion's failure confirmed Roman military supremacy in the harshest possible terms. The tribes had mustered their largest army, had achieved stunning initial victories, had destroyed entire cities, and still Rome had won. The legions had proven that discipline and training could overcome numbers and fury. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was futile. Better to accept Roman rule, adopt Roman ways, and survive than to fight and face annihilation. In the generations after Boudica, British resistance to Rome took different forms: cultural preservation, religious syncretism, economic adaptation, but never again open military rebellion on this scale. Yet Boudica's legacy endured in ways that neither Romans nor Britons could have predicted. Her story was recorded by Roman historians, preserved in the works of Tacitus and Cassius Dio. These accounts, while filtered through Roman perspective and literary convention, kept her memory alive through the collapse of the Roman Empire and the subsequent centuries. In medieval England, Boudica was largely forgotten, her story lost in the chaos of Saxon invasions and Norman conquest. But in the Renaissance, as scholars rediscovered classical texts, her tale re-emerged. By the Victorian era, Boudica had been transformed into a symbol of British resistance to tyranny. The same empire builders who styled themselves as inheritors of Roman civilization also claimed Boudica as a national hero, ignoring the ironic contradiction. A massive bronze statue of Boudica, riding a chariot with her daughters, was erected next to Westminster Bridge in London in 1902. The statue depicts her as a noble warrior queen, conveniently sanitizing the horrific violence of her campaign. This sanitized version of Boudica became embedded in British popular culture, a symbol of defiant independence rather than genocidal rage. The truth, as we have seen, is far more complex and far darker. Boudica was not fighting for noble ideals or abstract principles. She was fighting for revenge, pure and simple. The Romans had brutalized her and her daughters, had destroyed her kingdom, and had demonstrated utter contempt for British autonomy and dignity. Her response was to inflict suffering on a scale that would dwarf her own trauma. 70,000 people died because of decisions made by Roman administrators. Those deaths were no more just or necessary than the crimes that provoked them. This is the uncomfortable reality at the heart of Boudica's story. She was simultaneously a victim of horrific violence and a perpetrator of mass murder. Her daughters were innocent victims of rape, and she herself endured the humiliation of public flogging. These crimes against her were inexcusable, but the revenge she extracted, the slaughter of tens of thousands of civilians, the deliberate infliction of torture on prisoners, the burning of cities, was equally inexcusable. There is no moral high ground in this story, only cycles of violence and suffering. Modern archaeology has given us a visceral connection to these events that the ancient historians could not provide. When archaeologists excavate sites in Colchester, London, and St. Albans, they frequently encounter the destruction layer from 60–61 AD. They find the burnt remains of buildings, the carbonized wood and fired clay that marked the passage of Boudica's army. They find human remains, skulls smashed, bodies left unburied, the physical evidence of massacre. They find offerings that were never recovered, shops that were never reopened, lives that were never resumed. This is not abstract history. It is the material record of catastrophe. One particularly haunting discovery was made in London in the 1980s. Archaeologists excavating near the Thames found a layer of burnt material containing human skulls, just skulls, no other bones. Analysis suggested these were the heads of Boudica's victims, possibly displayed as trophies or dumped in the river after execution. The skulls showed evidence of violent trauma. They belonged to men, women, and children. They had lain in the Thames mud for nearly 2,000 years, silent witnesses to the fury that had consumed Roman London. When you walk through modern London, you're walking above the graves of people who died screaming Boudica's name. The question that haunts historians is, was there another path? Could Boudica have achieved justice without genocide? The answer is probably no. The Roman system did not recognize British legal claims or British sovereignty. Rome's entire imperial project was based on the assumption of cultural and military superiority. Romans believed they had the right to rule the world because they were civilized, and others were barbarous. This belief was not something that could be negotiated or compromised. It could only be accepted or resisted. Boudica chose resistance, and she chose it in the most absolute form possible. She rejected not just Roman political control, but Roman civilization itself. Every temple she burned, every city she destroyed, every Roman she killed was a statement. Rome and Britain could not coexist. One had to destroy the other. In the end, Rome survived, and Britain was absorbed into the empire. But the cost of that absorption was measured in tens of thousands of lives and the complete destruction of 3 cities. The Romans learned that conquest had limits, that brutality could provoke resistance that threatened the entire imperial project. In our modern context, Boudica's story resonates in uncomfortable ways. We live in an age acutely aware of imperial violence, colonial oppression, and the long-term trauma inflicted by systematic brutality. We can understand why a woman who had been flogged and whose daughters had been raped might seek vengeance. We can sympathize with tribes who had been conquered, exploited, and humiliated. But we also live in an age that has seen genocide, ethnic cleansing, and terrorist violence. We know that suffering does not justify atrocity, that being a victim does not give one license to create new victims. Boudica forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that oppressed people are not automatically noble, that resistance to tyranny can itself become tyrannical, that the line between justice and revenge is often invisible until you've already crossed it. The civilians of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were not personally responsible for Boudica's suffering. The merchant selling pottery in London, the child playing in the streets of Colchester, the elderly couple in Verulamium, they were not Roman soldiers or colonial administrators. They were people living their lives, guilty of nothing more than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths did not undo Boudica's trauma. They did not restore Iceni sovereignty. They simply added more suffering to an already overwhelming total. This is why Boudica's revenge was more savage than we think, not just because of the scale of killing or the methods of execution, though both were horrific. It was savage because it was so profoundly human. There was no strategy, no long-term plan for what would come after the rebellion. There was only rage, grief, and the overwhelming need to make someone, anyone, pay for what had been done. Boudica looked at the world Rome had created and decided that if she could not live in it with dignity, she would burn it to the ground. For a few brief weeks, she succeeded. Roman Britain ceased to exist, replaced by a nightmare landscape of smoking ruins and unburied dead. But nightmares end, and reality reasserts itself. Suetonius's legions demonstrated that Rome had not been defeated, merely surprised. The rebellion collapsed not because Boudica's cause was unjust, but because military reality does not care about justice. Discipline beats fury. Training beats numbers. Professional soldiers beat passionate warriors. The Romans rebuilt their cities, suppressed British resistance, and continued their occupation for another 3.5 centuries. Boudica's rebellion became a historical footnote, a moment of crisis overcome through Roman perseverance. Yet the memory of those weeks of fury never entirely faded. Romans who lived through the rebellion carried the memory of what British anger could accomplish when fully unleashed. They had seen their cities burn, their armies broken, their civilians slaughtered by the thousands. They had learned that military superiority was not the same as security, that conquest did not equal consent. The Britain that emerged from Boudica's rebellion was more heavily militarized, more carefully controlled, more thoroughly Roman than the province that had existed before. Rome had won, but the victory had required a level of violence and control that made the occupation's costs uncomfortably apparent. For the Britons, the rebellion's legacy was even more complex. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, that Rome could be hurt, that British warriors could destroy legions and burn cities. But it also demonstrated that resistance was ultimately futile, that Rome would respond to rebellion with overwhelming force, that the price of failed uprising was annihilation. Better to survive within the Roman system than to die resisting it. The British tribes that had remained neutral during the rebellion were rewarded. Those that had joined Boudica faced decades of suppression and poverty. The lesson was clear, and it was learned. And so we return to the question posed at the beginning. Was Boudica's revenge more savage than we think? The answer is yes, but not for the reasons we might assume. It was savage not because ancient warfare was brutal, that was universal. It was savage not because the killing was extensive. Ancient battles routinely produced massive casualties. It was savage because it was personal. Every death Boudica ordered, every city she burned, every temple she desecrated was a response to what had been done to her and her daughters. This was not war. It was a wound made visible, a trauma externalized and projected onto anyone within reach. The savagery lies in the intimacy of the violence. Boudica did not fight Romans abstractly. She fought the merchant who sold goods to legionaries. She fought the veteran who had been granted confiscated British land. She fought the priestess serving in the temple of Claudius. She fought the child of a Roman official, the wife of a collaborator, the elderly shopkeeper in Londinium. Each death was both too much and not enough. Too much because they were individuals who had done her no personal harm. Not enough because no amount of killing could undo her daughter's violation or erase the memory of her own humiliation. This is the horror that transcends the ancient world and speaks directly to our modern understanding of trauma and violence. We have seen this pattern repeat throughout history. Oppressed peoples rising in furious rebellion, inflicting horrific violence on anyone associated with their oppressors, and then being crushed by superior force. The Haitian Revolution, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Mau Mau Uprising, all followed similar patterns. Brutality provokes rebellion. Rebellion produces atrocities. Atrocities justify suppression. Suppression breeds new grievances. The cycle continues until either empire collapses or resistance is completely broken. Boudica's story is savage, because it forces us to see this cycle clearly, stripped of modern justifications and ideological frameworks. There was no democracy to defend, no freedom to preserve, no noble cause beyond revenge. There was only a woman who had suffered unbearable wrong and decided that if she could not have justice, she would have blood. And blood she had. Rivers of it, seas of it, enough blood to drown 3 cities and stain the land red for generations. And in the end, what did it accomplish? Her kingdom was still destroyed. Her daughter's innocence was still lost. Rome still ruled Britain. Nothing was undone. Nothing was made right. There was only more suffering, more death, more trauma to be passed down through generations. This is why we should remember Boudica not as a hero or a villain, but as a warning about what happens when power is exercised without restraint, when human dignity is violated with impunity, when grievance is allowed to fester until it explodes into violence. The Romans created Boudica through their brutality. Her response was monstrously disproportionate. Both things can be true simultaneously. The procurator who ordered her flogging and her daughter's rape bears responsibility for everything that followed. And Boudica bears responsibility for ordering the massacre of tens of thousands of people who had not harmed her. We want history to be simple. We want clear heroes and villains, obvious right and wrong. Boudica's story refuses to grant us that comfort. It is messy, horrifying, tragic, and profoundly human. A woman suffered terrible violence. She inflicted terrible violence in return. Innocent people died in staggering numbers. An empire learned limits it had not known it had. A culture of resistance was both born and crushed simultaneously. And 2,000 years later, We are still excavating the burnt layers, still finding the skulls in the Thames, still trying to understand how human beings can do such things to each other. The final savage truth of Boudica's revenge is that it changed nothing and everything simultaneously. In practical terms, Roman Britain continued essentially as before. The cities were rebuilt, the legions remained, the empire endured, but in psychological and cultural terms, everything had changed. Rome knew it was vulnerable. Britain knew it was capable of resistance. The memory of those weeks of apocalyptic violence was embedded in the land itself, preserved in ash and bone, waiting to be discovered by future generations who would struggle to comprehend the fury that had created such destruction. When you stand in modern London, in Colchester, in St. Albans, you are standing on ground that Boudica's fires touched. The burnt layer is still there, beneath the streets and buildings. The memory is still there, in the archaeological record and the historical sources, and the questions are still there, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Was there another way? Could justice have been achieved without massacre? When does resistance become terrorism? When does revenge become genocide? How much suffering justifies how much retaliation? Boudica does not answer these questions. She only embodies them. Her story is savage not because it is ancient, but because it is eternal. The pattern of oppression and violent resistance, of brutality answered with brutality, of trauma turned outward into mass violence. This pattern did not die with Boudica. It lives still, in every conflict where power and powerlessness meet, where dignity is violated and revenge is sought. We remember her, not because she was unique, but because she was universal. She is every victim who became a perpetrator, every justified grievance that metastasized into unjustifiable violence, every wound that refused to heal and instead infected everything it touched. This is Boudica's true legacy, not defiant independence or noble resistance, but the savage truth that violence begets violence, that trauma creates trauma, that revenge never satisfies the hunger it feeds. 70,000 people died because Roman officials committed horrific crimes against one woman and her daughters. Those 70,000 deaths did not undo those crimes. They only added more names to the list of victims, more grief to the sum of human suffering. And in the end, everyone lost. The Romans who rebuilt their cities from ash, the Britons who faced Roman retaliation, and most of all, Boudica herself, who died knowing that her revenge had been total and absolutely meaningless. That is the savage truth we must carry from this story. Not the exciting tale of chariots and burning cities, not the dramatic narrative of rebellion and defeat, but the quiet, awful recognition that the worst violence in human history is committed not by monsters, but by wounded people trying to make their pain mean something. Boudica's revenge was more savage than we think, not because of what she did, but because of why she did it. And because we understand that why all too well.